Donald Trump Jr. I don't even have to introduce you, really.
Good to be with you here.
It's a pleasure. We've never met before, have we?
We hadn't, not in person. No, I've been watching for a while.
Well, thank you. Likewise. You've written an unbelievable book here, Donald Trump Jr. Triggered, How the Left Thrives on Hate and Wants to Silence Us. Nobody knows this better than your family.
Yeah, we've been through a lot. I think it was interesting. For years, people say, Don, you should write the business book. And honestly, I was like, I think my father's really had that covered. But for me, over the last few years, what I've got to experience, both having a sort of front row seat to political history, getting to be at least one of the tips of the spear of the greatest political upset ever, to also being, the number 2 subject of the greatest witch hunt ever with the Mueller hoax. I said, you know what, now's a time to actually write this book. I've been all over America, got to experience some incredible stuff, see what my father's actually doing, and for me as an American, as a citizen, as a father of 5 young kids, this is my chance to act and to help. And again, I don't know that anyone's seen it or had a better or closer look to the hypocrisy of the left probably than me these days.
I suspect, not knowing, that for most of your life, left, right, so forth and so on, you're a businessman, relatively conservative as a matter of conscience, as a matter of common sense. Then you hit this buzzsaw on the left.
Hell yeah.
It's kind of changed a little bit, hasn't it?
It has. Listen, I think, again, I don't necessarily come from a conservative background, though I've always been a conservative. I think a big part of that was having a mother who grew up in communist Czechoslovakia and escaped. When I see some of the sort of mainstream politicians of today talking about the great virtues of socialism and communism, I go back to that in my childhood, going over there every summer with my grandfather, who was a blue-collar electrician and really wanted to make sure that we, his grandchildren, experienced that. And I think it was a big part of why we don't take things for granted that perhaps we would otherwise. And so growing up with that, having a grandmother who's 93, who didn't lead an easy life. I mean, this is someone who spent years hiding in the basement of her farmhouse from the Nazis growing up, then lived through communist occupation. She calls me to this day, Mark, in tears. She watches CNN over there. They don't have an outlet like this where you may have the conservative viewpoint. And so, Don, you don't understand. The socialism, it always sounds so great on paper. It's always free. Everything's always great. You don't understand. And I have to assure you, trust me, I know. I'm on the leading edge of pushing back against this nonsense. But when you have a woman who's been through that, who's in tears for fear of the well-being of her children and her grandchildren, her great-grandchildren, it has to tell you something. And I always say, it's interesting with this socialism, communism thing becoming a mainstream part of the Democrat Party. It's no longer a fringe element. The leading candidates all espouse these virtues. I always ask, I go, why is it, Mark, that there's no one, not one person, from former, communist side of Eastern Europe, from the former Soviet Union, from communist China, let's bring it closer to home, from Venezuela, from Cuba. How come there's no one who's lived there that comes here and says, you know what, we got to bring that experiment here. It's wonderful. It's done incredible things. The Democrats will find someone who can vouch for and say anything, but they can't find someone who's lived under those systems to bring them here. And doesn't that tell us all we need to know? And so while I may be an unlikely conservative on paper in the sense that I'm a guy from New York City, the son of a billionaire, went to an Ivy League school, my experiences throughout life, and certainly the experiences I've had over the last few years, only solidify my resolve to really fight for conservative values and beliefs.
Your father's been called a blue-collar billionaire.
I coined that, Mark, 10 or 15 years ago, and I got all sorts of hell for it. Back then, it wasn't as vicious as it is today. But I said that, and it's because he's a builder. He spent his career building projects, and he didn't build, in the confines of a high office tower surrounded by executives telling him what he wants. He spent time on the ground. He spent time on those construction sites. He spent time with those blue-collar, oftentimes, union, oftentimes Democrat builders, construction workers. He knows those people. He spoke with them. That's what made him a better builder. He got information from them. He utilized that throughout his career. So while he's an unlikely voice to be able to speak to working class America, he's able to do that because he's been doing it his whole life. He knows those guys. He listens to those guys. He understands those guys.
What's interesting about this? When you look at the Democrat Party lineup, none of them have.
No, they haven't done anything. You know, they talk in theory, not in practice. And I think when you look at the successes of his presidency, and I talk about this extensively in the book, it's because he's actually done this. He's actually signed the front of a paycheck, not just the back. He's actually created jobs, not just talking about it in theory. He's done it in practice. He's had people, their families, their livelihoods, their well-being dependent on his success every day for 40 years. He's actually done it. And so when he talks about it, and he talked about it on the campaign trail, this is what we're going to do, and this is how we're going to achieve X, Y, Z. Now we're reaping the benefits of that. And people say, oh, well, it's not. He's been doing it his whole life. He understands it. Our political class doesn't. And that's a big problem. Our political class are politicians. They've not done these things. They oftentimes can't relate to the people that they represent. There was a female congresswoman, I was talking about it during midterms, who was hosting seminars, wine and cheese dinners for other Democrats running to teach them how to speak to their constituencies. I mean, I just had the greatest laugh about that. Because, imagine, you live there. These are your neighbors. And you have to go to someone else in another district to learn about how to speak to your neighbors. And yet, the brash billionaire from New York City is able to just go out there and have that conversation with, not the conversation at. We get plenty of lecturing from the other side, but he's actually having that conversation with the hardworking men and women of this country who just want to live their American dream. And that makes them a terrible person these days. Wanting to experience the American dream for themselves rather than it be sort of our number one export as a country. We've sent that American dream to countries in far-off land. They hate our guts. They hate our freedoms. They hate our religion. They hate our values. We've sent them our American dream due to stupid trade practices, incompetent politicians, just a string of bad decision-making from people who are in charge, who have no business being in charge of anything, let alone our country.
Let me ask you this. When you watch how your father's portrayed in the media, 90%, 95% of the media, the man you grew up with, and you say, blue collar, he went down on the streets, down to the job sites. Not only that, he hired minorities galore, whether it's African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Asian Americans, females and so forth. And you hear things said about your father that you know to be as dishonest and untrue as imaginable. What does that do to you and the rest of your family?
Honestly, it just makes me want to fight that much more. I know it to be nonsense. So many of those people saying those things, it's interesting. We have pictures with them over the decades, hanging out with my father, taking pictures with my father, being at dinners and parties with my father, showing up to his office. All of a sudden you become a conservative and, all that's forgotten. That's the reality. When I hear the stuff about racism, it drives me nuts. But the real problem with it is it's sort of become the political easy button of the left. It's like, can't win an argument. Racist. Don't have any facts to back me up. Racist. Facts are like left-wing kryptonite, right? They don't really work in your favor, but the real issue is that, stuff like racism, those are real problems in our country. It's just not the answer to every argument someone can't win from the left, and that's what it's become. And the real issue with that is it does such a huge disservice, Mark, to those who are actually afflicted by real racism, because now people, they hear it and it's like, okay, roll your eyes, move on. The people who are actually afflicted are ultimately then ignored because everyone uses it for everything and every argument that they can't win with facts, with reason, or with logic. And that's sort of a big problem.
It's a fantastic book. Donald Trump Jr. triggered how the left thrives. I got to take my glasses off so I can read.
No worries.
How the left thrives on hate and wants to silence us. And you have been subjected to this. Your sister has. Okay. Your brother has. Your brother-in-law. But you've been dragged in front of Congress. You've been dragged in front of all these investigative committees behind closed doors for the most part. You've had to hire lawyers. You've had to spend money on this sort of thing.
Lots.
Dozens and dozens of people close to the President of the United States have. And to what end? For what purpose?
None. They're trying to, reverse the results of an election that they didn't agree with, though the American people obviously agreed. The impeachment probe right now, guess what? That started on November 9th, 2016. Whatever they can do to backfill it. I mean, you saw the Mueller report, and again, for me, I could write about it extensively in the book because I think it's pretty safe to say that I was the number 2 target. If they couldn't get my father, they would have loved to have taken me down. And I just remember going through it, and, it took me maybe 41 years to realize I was a lot more like my father than anyone would have called before that, including ourselves. But you put us in that corner, and we fight back. We push back hard. I mean, I certainly did that during the probe. My father certainly does that. And I think it's been a great thing in the sense that it's shown conservatives that you can actually fight back. You don't just have to turn the other cheek. We've done that for 50 years, and all we've done is cede ground to the lunatic fringe of the left and their policies. So, for me, it was an interesting experience. But it wasn't just, half of government literally trying to throw you in jail for quote-unquote treason for taking an unsolicited phone call. Meanwhile, the other candidate, Hillary Clinton, can have a DNC-funded operation where they're paying foreign operatives to dig up dirt, seed that with the FBI, leak it to the press, use that as a justification to then start a witch hunt, bring in Robert Mueller. Obviously, they only brought him in because he was the former head of the FBI and he was a decorated Marine, so he's above reproach. Trump cannot possibly attack him. He brings in 19 Hillary donors to try to prosecute this nonsense claim and this fake dossier. But then, then they were going to get him finally. They were going to get Trump. We're going to put him on the stage. We're going to put him on the stand. And within about 30 seconds, the American public realized that this thing was one big joke, that they used Robert Mueller simply because of the credentials and sort of, again, the fact that he was beyond reproach because of his resume. And they realized this guy had no idea what he's even talking about. I mean, within about 30 seconds, it was, Mr. Mueller, have you actually read the report that bears your name? I don't know. That's beyond my purview. That's beyond my purview, Congressman. I mean, it was a joke. And I do believe that, despite sort of the media attacks, the American people get it, Mark. The American people see it for what it is. They see the nonsense. They see the witch hunt. They see the bias. And man, if they were, let's call it, there's a better word for it, but for TV, I'll say, if they were annoyed in 2016, I think they're going to be that much more annoyed in 2020.
When we come back, I want to ask you what it was like in those little sessions, hours and hours at a time. Sure.